pleasure to be participating in this Limud conference, and it's a double pleasure for me because Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks has been one of my heroes for a long, long time. I was devastated when he died much too young. And I think it behooves all of us to think seriously about the contribution he made and the ideas that he made public both within the Jewish world and really all around the world. In many ways, you know, I consider Jonathan Sacks to have been the foremost public intellectual in Europe, certainly in Europe and also in the United States, I would say, of our generation. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the man himself, but really more about what I consider to be his fundamental ideas. And they were the absolute centrality and necessity of morality. Secondly, the need for Judaism and for Jews to speak to the world, to get out of the ghetto, to get out of our own community, and to have an influence and impact the world. And thirdly, the idea of difference and pluralism. And that's a little more dicey. We're going to talk about that in a while. But his firm belief that human diversity and difference and multiple truths are essential for the flourishing of humanity. So those are the three ideas I really wanted to explore with you. And let me just say that I don't want this to be a one-man show. I don't want this to be a lecture. I really want to hear your ideas and have discussions on this. And I would ask you, if you have a comment or a question, please indicate it in the chat room, and hopefully we'll be able to maintain some order, and we'll be able to invite you into the conversation if you are listed in the chat room. So just a few words about Lord Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. He was born in March in 1948. He was born to a very Jewish, but not necessarily learned or traditional family. That makes his prominence within the world rabbinate even more remarkable. He studied in England. He was a student of philosophy. He had a PhD in philosophy. He studied with some of the world's greatest moral philosophers at a time when the reigning kind of the dominant attitude in the world of moral philosophy was that ethics and morality were not objective categories. They were expressions of emotion. They were expressions of subjective preference. They didn't have much cognitive value, which led to a kind of, I would say, a de-emphasis of the seriousness of morality and ethics and ethical values. Now, he was quite fortunate. God works in wonderful ways sometimes. He was quite fortunate in having mentors in university who ran against the trend of this moral subjectivism or moral relativism. And they felt, and I think they conveyed their notion to him, that he felt deeply that there is something objective about morality. You just can't say whatever you want in the name of ethics and morality. There are certain rules, and morality, in fact, was built in to the objective nature of the universe. And morality also, or at least a certain basic common morality, was absolutely essential for the flourishing of humankind and civilization. And we'll talk a little bit about what those principles were. He saw this, he came to see this as an expression of the deepest impulses of Jewish tradition and Jewish rabbinical literature. He was very fond of quoting a Mishnah in Sanhedrin that said, the Mishnah asks an interesting question. It says, why did God create all of humanity, from one person, one prototype, Adam? Wouldn't it have made more sense, to take a Caucasian couple and a Negroid couple and an Asian couple and let humanity develop from these different couples, different races, different genetic categories? And the Mishnah says, no, it says that the reason that all of humanity proceeded from one prototype, Adam and Eve, is to teach us some moral truths. Number one, that each person is like a world unto himself. That each person, saving one life is like saving the whole world, because from one person, all of humanity comes. And the other reason is that, so no person can say, well, my father was greater than your father. In other words, we're all equal. We all come from the same source. And therefore, nobody can claim genetic superiority or racial superiority. And these were fundamental moral notions that animated nearly everything that Jonathan Sacks said. So that was some of the notion of morality that he had. The other notion is that Jews, and in particular religious Jews, I have to say, have a mission in the world. That the Torah, the Bible, teaches that God challenged the Jewish people, to be a blessing to the world, and through us, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. Isaiah called it light unto the nations. And another way of saying that is that we're not supposed to be a ghetto people. We're supposed to be the major actors and influencers and conveyors of truth and culture to the world. And certainly Rabbi Sacks's life was an illustration of that. At a time when it seems that the more religious one is, the more one kind of buries his head in the ghetto. Rabbi Sacks ran against the grain of all of this, and he spoke to the world. He spoke to everybody. He spoke to kings and queens, and prime ministers and presidents, and philosophers, and journalists, and atheists. Anybody who had an impact on human culture, inside the Jewish world, outside the Jewish world. He somehow had a conversation, either a written conversation or a conversation based on events. He was all over the place in that sense, because he felt that it was part of his mission, qua rabbi, qua Jew, to bring light unto the nations, to use Isaiah's phrase. And indeed, the Prince of Wales called him a light unto the nation. He was an advisor to the royal family in England. I mean, that's how far his influence spread in that regard. So we can talk a lot about that, because much of Jewish culture, much of Jewish conversation today kind of has to walk a fine line between preserving our distinctiveness and our particularity, and yet still being responsible and accountable and participating in world culture and in humanity per se. Sometimes that's not an easy dialectic to manage, but that was really part of his deepest conviction. And the third major principle that animated his thinking was that diversity, human diversity, intellectual diversity, personality differences, religious differences, cultural differences were not something to be overcome, but they were part of God's plan, right? They were virtues. They are built into the fabric of the human experience. The end of that Mishnah in Sanhedrin, which also he was very fond of quoting, right? It says, another reason that humanity proceeded from one source, Adam and Eve, was to show you how great God is. because God is not like human beings. When God creates, it's not like the way human beings create. If you go to, if most of you are in America, if you go to Philadelphia to the U.S. Mint, right, you see how they make nickels. They have one template, and from that template, they produce millions of nickels each year. But each nickel is just like every other nickel, right? So the Mishnah says God is not that way. God starts with the same template, with the same genetic pool, and he produces millions or billions of human beings, and no one person is like another person. And that's not a fact to be overcome. Human difference and human diversity and religious difference is actually something that is of religious value. Now, this also, I think, runs against the grain of a lot of religious dynamics today, because so much of religion is about conformity and uniformity, right? And trying to conquer the other person who has different religious views or religious behavior than you do. And Sacks kind of turned this around, and he saw this as deeply Jewish. He turned it around and said, no, human diversity and religious diversity is part of God's plan. Right? So he wrote a book called The Dignity of Difference, in which he argued very passionately for the legitimacy and the necessity to dignify difference, individual human difference, social differences, religious differences, and even theological differences. Now that got him into some hot water at times, because how far can you push this? That's something that we can talk about. So those are what I see, just a regel achat, as they say, in Latin. Just very, very briefly, I think three of the broad themes, that nearly that appear in nearly all of Jonathan Sacks's works. So at this point, let me just stop and ask if anybody, would like to comment on any of this. Okay, well, if not, then I can continue talking. Excuse me. One of the, on this theme of diversity, another Jewish source, Talmudic source, rabbinic source that he was fond of quoting was the supposed conversation that God had with the angels when he created the world. So God, like any good manager, didn't want to create the world on his own. So he actually had consultants. And the consultants were the angels. And one of the angels was the angel of truth. And he asked Truth, should I create human beings? And Truth said, no, don't create human beings, because they're only going to argue with each other, because they have different ideas, and they're going to promote fake news and falsehood. And so it's better that you don't create human beings. And then he consulted with the angel of compassion, or Rachamim. And the angel of compassion said, yes, create human beings, because they'll do great acts of chesed. They'll do great acts of loving kindness and compassion. So, so what did God do? Because he had opposite opinions from his consultants. So the Midrash says that God took truth and he threw truth down to the ground, and truth hit the ground and shattered. And the way Jonathan Sacks understood that was that, yeah, there may be one ultimate truth with the capital T, okay? But truth on earth, right, when it hits the ground, is shattered. And therefore, it's not one great truth, there are multiple truths. So we on earth, human beings, when we search for truth, have to understand that there are multiple truths. Truth, there's no one Platonic truth. And this, by the way, this runs against the whole grain of rationalist Greek and medieval philosophy, which taught that, that what was true for me had to be true for you also. Right? Just like 2 and 2 equals 4 for me, If that's true mathematically, it's got to be true mathematically for you. That was the rationalist school of philosophy. But Lord Sacks opposed that view, and he saw it as the source of terrible evil and terrible persecution over human history. You know, the drive to make everybody the same, the drive to convert everybody to a true religion, is a force for evil in the world. We have to admit difference, we have to respect difference, and we have to give dignity to people who are different and have different views. And he, as a Jew, understood that particularly well, because he saw the Jews, the Jewish people, as being the ultimate scandal of particularity. That is, we were persecuted historically, you know, by every universal scheme, and nearly every universal scheme, you know, in human history, whether it was the Roman Empire, and after that, the Catholic Church or the Christian Church at the time. And after that, it was the 18th and 19th century rationalist universalists, or the communists or Nazism. You know, all of these ideologies or religions that only believed that there was one true path for human beings. They all wound up persecuting Jews, because Jews stood for the principle of difference. We didn't fit in, and because we wouldn't assimilate to a larger culture or to a larger or a more dominant religion, you know, we were persecuted for it. So we are the proof of this truth that that the Midrash held, that for human beings to survive and to thrive and to flourish, you know, we have to be willing to be tolerant and admit difference and to be pluralistic in that sense. This was very deep in him, and that's why, and that was his message, by the way. He spoke very eloquently about anti-Semitism late in his life, when the anti-Semitism began to resurge, particularly in Europe. And he spoke very eloquently about this to the, I don't know how many of you have seen a wonderful, a magnificent speech that he gave to the European Parliament. You know, you can get it on YouTube. He spoke for about, I think, 20 minutes to the leaders of Europe, the European Parliament, in which he talked about anti-Semitism, you know, as not only an anti-Jewish, but an immoral disease that metastasizes, and what starts with the Jews doesn't end with the Jews. In other words, we are the test case for this principle of the connection between respecting diversity and human flourishing. I would ask all of you, or recommend all of you, to look up this YouTube speech about him speaking to the European Parliament. It's just a magnificent statement. The truth is that he believed this, but he was in a funny position, in that he was an Orthodox rabbi. Now, orthodoxy, or the term orthodox, means correct belief or right belief. So orthodoxy in itself, you know, has a kind of built-in limitation on how far it can admit diversity and pluralism. And he was kind of caught in the dilemma. Existentially, he was caught in a dilemma, functioning as an Orthodox rabbi, who believed that orthodoxy was the true Judaism, and therefore had to reject interpretations of Judaism that contradicted orthodoxy, like many aspects of Reform Judaism. And yet he was he preached difference and diversity as a virtue. So this was a difficult dilemma that he had. He had to walk a very, very fine line. Sometimes he fell off that line. You know, there was a famous incident that took place, a kind of sad incident that took place, where by virtue of the fact that he was the chief rabbi of British Jewry, or at least Orthodox British Jewry, right, he decided not to attend the funeral of the most prominent Reform rabbi in England, a man named Hugo Gryn. And that caused enormous hurt. The Reform community, for whom Hugo Gryn was the respected rabbi, felt terribly slighted by the fact that Rabbi Sacks did not attend that funeral. And the reason he didn't attend the funeral was because his attendance would have been tantamount to acknowledging the validity of Reform Judaism. Now, I don't know what he felt inside of himself, cognitively or intellectually, but I think, he was forced politically not to make that gesture of going to the funeral. So the whole notion of the virtue of pluralism, had its limits for him. Many of the people who follow him and follow his writings maintain that he really did not believe in pluralism, he believed in difference. And in fact, he was forced to retract some of the things that he said in the first edition of The Dignity of Difference and limit some of his pluralistic statement. But he did believe, by the way, and I think he was very consistent in this throughout his whole life, that no religion has a monopoly on religious truth. No religion has a corner on what God is and what God is not. And that we can all learn from religions outside of Judaism. And we must accord respect to religious people, who disagree with us, if right, they accept the basic rules of human civilization and morality, namely the dignity and the sanctity of individuals, the equality of human beings, and the necessity to have what he called a covenant or a social contract. That is the moral requirement, to cooperate with each other in building a society. That was for him the basic root of morality that all human beings had to subscribe to. After that, we can have different moralities, so to speak, plurality of moralities, as long as, these fundamental principles are accepted. The equality of human beings, the sanctity of human beings, and the necessity of respecting the dignity of other human beings. So again, even in the notion of his morality, it was very nuanced. He believed that there was a certain set of universal principles of morality, and he saw that as an outgrowth of Jewish tradition. And yet he had to admit that there are different moralities in the plural. Okay, but all of these sub-moralities, so to speak, had to accept these basic axioms of universal human morality. Now, that I think is a very important message for us today. When we see, it's an important message throughout human history, but in particular today, where we see a rise of hate, a lack of tolerance, a lack of understanding of people who are different from us, and a kind of resort to overwhelming those people who disagree with us, either through force or through law. So I think his message is very, very important today. It's another reason why it was so tragic that his voice ended 15 months ago when he passed away prematurely. His message is enormously important, both, I think, for Jews as a Jewish community and for humanity. And that's why he became such a celebrated public intellectual inside the Jewish community and outside the Jewish community. I see we have a comment. So David Brody said it's his hope. It's also my hope, David, that Jonathan Sacks's words did and will bring much bring to the world much closer to peace and harmony. Yes, it's true. But I think one of the things that Jonathan Sacks used to stress, and again, he saw this as a Jewish principle, that words are not enough, sermons are not enough. In classical Judaism, in rabbinic Judaism, there's a principle, Ein ha-midrasha ikar ela ha-maaseh, that it's not the words that are the most important thing, right? It's the doing, it's the behavior, right? If you believe in morality, you can't just give sermons. You can't just give good philosophy classes about ethics. You have to also commit yourself to a life of moral improvement and to influencing others. Now, he influenced others by inspiring them with his words. And that will be the ultimate, I think, judgment about Lord Sacks's importance. To what extent did his message, did his philosophy, did his teaching, inspire others to be better people, to increase understanding and harmony and social cooperation? And to what extent, did he inspire Jews to understand the nature of Judaism and to become more committed to live Jewishly? That, I think, ultimately will determine his legacy, so to speak. It wasn't his brilliant, it's not his brilliant rhetoric, it's the degree to which he had an impact on people. Now, again, you would say, well, this is kind of motherhood and apple pie, right? I mean, but the truth is, we see things in the Jewish world and outside the Jewish world, which really run counter to these notions. There is a notion amongst many, many Jews. I live in Jerusalem. There is a notion in Jerusalem, that the more religious you are, the more insulated you are, the more parochial you are. You don't get involved in world events. You're just concerned with Israel or the Jewish community or the religious community per se. That would have been heresy to Lord Sacks. There is this notion that there is only one religious truth, and that truth should be imposed upon others. We see that both in Israel, and we see that in America too, both in the religious sphere and in the political sphere. Raw power has really undergone, I think, a certain rebirth in that sense. We're less willing to talk to people, to listen to people, to accept the fact that people are different and have a right to be different. So you see a rise in racial theories. You see a rise in white supremacy, for instance. You see a rise in hatred against Jews, against Asians, against Blacks. All of this was completely heretical, or was total anathema to Jonathan Sacks. And we need his voice, and we need his teaching more than ever today. So again, it wasn't about his brilliant rhetoric. It was about to what extent, he really made an impact on the world. He certainly made an impact, on world leaders. To what extent his influence will filter down, into the communities per se, not amongst the intellectual political elite, but the community per se. I think that's will determine the extent to which he is understood to be a great figure. And I believe firmly that his legacy will be preserved and appreciated, both within the Jewish community and outside of the Jewish community. Okay, we have another comment here from Merle, right? Can you share about his relationships with other religious leaders and some of the outcomes of those religious? Yes, he was very, very close with the Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Episcopal Church, or the Church of England. Last I heard, that was not another denomination of Judaism. but they actually had a very, very good relationship, and they consulted each other. And he was invited to speak, in churches. He spoke at the Vatican. I don't think he had a close relationship with the Pope in the Vatican, but he was, I think about 3 years ago, there was an interfaith meeting in the Vatican. The Pope called great religious leaders around the world to come and to talk and to speak. And he was the star of the show. I mean, because of his rhetorical brilliance and because of the depth of his ideas. Yeah, he did. And again, it was because he believed in the dignity of difference, and it was part of God's plan for the world to have different religions. In that sense, he was a theological pluralist, and yet he believed in the ultimate truth of Judaism, of Orthodox Judaism, one could say, or traditional rabbinic Judaism, one could say. So he was a master in appreciating those who were different from him, and yet holding fast to his belief in the truth of traditional Judaism, in that sense. But yes, he did have close relationships with many, many people and many other religious leaders. It was because of his sparkling personality, it was because of his wisdom, and it was because of his depth, his humanity and his depth. Now, let me just mention something. How did Rabbi Sacks come to be who he was? Who really influenced him? So he talked a lot about the influence that the former Lubavitcher Rebbe had on him. When he was young and trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life, he came to the United States and he sought out a number of great rabbis, great intellectual rabbis, great political rabbis, and the one who really made the lasting impact on him was the Lubavitcher Rebbe. Not because the Lubavitcher Rebbe was the most brilliant rabbi he met, he was not. But the Lubavitcher Rebbe had this kind of spiritual charisma and basic human understanding of what made the young Jonathan Sacks tick. And he asked Jonathan Sacks, he says, what do you want to do with your life? What are you going to be? And he said, well, maybe I'll teach philosophy, or maybe I'll become a lawyer. And Jonathan and the Lubavitcher Rebbe said, no, that's not what you were created to be. You were created to be a rabbi and to influence Jews. And somehow that message really struck home with the young student, Jonathan Sacks. And he began to think seriously about studying to be a rabbi. And it was that 2 or 3 meetings that he had with the Lubavitcher Rebbe when he was a young man, that put him on the path to become a rabbi and a Jewish leader. And it shows you the power of one person, one person in the form of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, change history, or at least change Jewish history for sure. Jonathan Sacks may have become a brilliant philosopher like Bertrand Russell, but he wouldn't have had the impact, that he had as chief rabbi and as a public intellectual. So yes, I mean, he was a model. I mean, to answer the question, he was really a model for interfaith cooperation and friendship in that regard. Again, which is a tough thing to do qua Orthodox rabbi, because there are severe limits on Orthodox dogma and Orthodox tradition in that respect. But he was able to kind of bridge the gap, again, not without some difficulty. Let's take some other questions here.
Rabbi Korn, there was one that says someone, Bracha, she would had a question, how have his 3 main areas of ethical principles impacted on your life and work? And I think there's also an important question by Laura Sacks. Do we have any other Jews who are leaders like Rabbi Sacks who we can hope can continue his work?
Well, Bracha, I mean, I think that one of the reasons he became one of my heroes personally is that I had kind of deeply internalized the principles that animated him, but I wasn't able to articulate them or to, make them as explicit, until I read his stuff. And that's why they resonated with me very much. So in that sense, he kind of brought above the surface what was subconscious or implicit or beneath the surface before. I mean, it's in a certain sense, there's this beautiful Hebrew phrase, yedid nefesh, right, a soulmate. And that's when I read his stuff, I said, wow, he's a yedid nefesh because he's touching on things that I believe very deeply too. So he did have an impact on me in that regard. And I had some conversations with him, long distance conversations, about some of the things that he said. But he was an enormously inspirational, figure. Are there others like him? I don't see anybody like him on the horizon. I mean, he was really unique in that regard because he had the religious learning, he had the Jewish learning, and he had the worldliness and the philosophical sophistication and the ability to communicate. That is a very rare package. It happens maybe once in a generation at best. So unfortunately, I don't see anybody, coming up in the ranks right now that that could be like him. But there will be. I mean, that's part of our faith in humanity and in God and the Jewish people. There will arise another person, another rabbi, maybe, who will have these sparkling qualities. And part of Jewish tradition is that you develop these qualities by studying and learning about, the greats of the past. So we draw inspiration from them, we learn from them, and we develop ourselves. And hopefully we can try to emulate them. I can't think of anybody who's on the horizon today, but there will, just like there was another Rabbi Akiva, just like there were people who rivaled Maimonides. There'll be people who draw nourishment and inspiration from Rabbi Sacks, and will develop into something a little different, but also will have enormous impact. Let's see. Oh, yes. Now, this is interesting. This is a tough question that Paul Gloverman has asked. Can you comment on his position on the role of women in the Orthodox community other than as mothers? I think given his understanding of the sanctity of every individual, right, I think he encouraged women in the Orthodox community, outside the Orthodox community, to develop their talents, and to now. This is part of the tough position of being a progressive Orthodox rabbi, or being a communal servant. When you're a communal servant or a communal leader, if your ideas are too far ahead of the community, nobody's going to listen. And yet, if your ideas are no different from the community, you're not a leader. So the real talent is to be one step or two steps ahead of the community, but not 3 steps or 4 steps ahead of the community. Now, feminism or women's rights or the roles of women was not something that he publicly talked about very much. But one can extrapolate from the rest of his ethical philosophy and his understanding of the sanctity of every human being, male and female. It's not hard to extrapolate, how he felt about the role of women and the contributions that women can make to human culture and certainly to the Jewish community. And yet he couldn't be too far ahead of the Orthodox community that he was obligated to serve. So he didn't talk that much about it, and not to my knowledge anyway. I would love to discover some texts or some speeches or some conversations that that he had on the issue of the status of women and women leadership and all of that. But that wasn't one of his pet areas, so to speak. Now, he did cultivate a number of women students, so he certainly wasn't parochial or old school, you know, about teaching women Torah or respecting women's intelligence in that regard. But this was not one of his chief philosophical or religious areas of concern. Oh yes, here's something that I'm glad Peter Sevitt mentioned this, that he had a weekly conversation with Tony Blair when Tony Blair was PM, was the Prime Minister, as well as with David Cameron. And he was asked to advise the government. Now just think about that. Why would Tony Blair or David Cameron, you know, ask an Orthodox rabbi to be a consultant for the government? You know, it wasn't because he knew Gemara. It wasn't because he knew. It was because he was a reservoir of human wisdom and moral sobriety. You know, he just his philosophy and his religious training, you know, enabled him to understand what needed to be done in certain situations, be they religious situations or political situations or cultural situations. So he was respected by a wide variety of personalities. I mentioned the Prince of Wales. You know, the Prince of Wales asked him to come talk, you know, to some of the royal family that was having family problems. Now, it wasn't because he was a rabbi. It was just because he was a wise human being who understood people and who had a very good sense of value. So yes, he was a valued member of British society. That's why he became a Lord. He was in the House of Lords because of his contributions across the board to British society. So that's why I say, you know, he might be the most influential public intellectual, you know, of the last generation. So we have time for a few more. Yes, so here's Patty Cohen made the following comment that's quite astute. He said, even though Rabbi Sacks didn't attend the funeral of a Reformed rabbi of great respect out of political reasons due to his loyalty to Orthodox Judaism, it is inconsistent with his ideas of truth outside of Judaism. Can that be reconciled? Now, I don't know if it can be reconciled totally. You know, in some sense, and Jewish rabbis and Jewish philosophers and thinkers are talking about this point until today. You know, what are the limits of legitimate pluralism? Now, it turns out for Orthodox rabbis, it's sometimes easier to acknowledge the legitimacy of other religions than it is for other denominations within Judaism. I know that to be true personally, because I'm involved in much interfaith affairs, and sometimes it's easier to get Orthodox rabbis in a room with the Pope or with cardinals of the Roman Catholic Church or with the Archbishop of Canterbury than it is to get them into a room with non-Orthodox rabbis. Okay, so the problem that Rabbi Sacks and many of us have is that in many ways it's easier to acknowledge the legitimacy of non-Jewish religions than it is with heterodox Jewish interpretation. Um, and that's the dilemma that he had. That's the real dilemma. No, people did not criticize him for going to the Vatican and talking with the Pope or talking with the Archbishop of Canterbury, but there were part of the Orthodox world did criticize him for somehow extending too much respect or acknowledgement or recognition to Reform Jews. So no, yes, there is a certain inconsistency there. So he was willing to be pluralistic in the deepest sense of the term. He was willing to be pluralistic with respect to non-Jewish religions, right? But he restrained himself to a certain degree on his pluralism with respect to heterodox forms of Judaism. And that's why he spoke of difference more often than he spoke of pluralism with respect to the larger Jewish community. He demanded that all Jews respect each other and give each other dignity, but he could not, out of his Orthodox commitments, concede in the truth of heterodox interpretations of Judaism. So yes, there is a deep dialectic going on there. There's a deep tension going on there that has not yet been resolved. I agree. And that's unfortunately a source of great pain within the Jewish community. I don't know how we're going to sort that out, but it needs to be sorted out, and because it's causing disrespect and pain, within the larger Jewish community. Which brings me to one of the last points that I can make about his whole philosophy about the Jewish people. He believed that we are one people, and we must continue to be one people. And in order for that to be more than just empty rhetoric, that we have to see each other as brothers and sisters and respect each other and give dignity to each other, and minimize as much as possible infighting and name calling that unfortunately we see so often in the Jewish community. I live in Israel. I'm speaking from Jerusalem now. In 2 days, less than a day and a half, we have elections. And the way Jews talk to each other in the midst of an election campaign, is certainly not a model for respect and pluralism. We desperately could use Jonathan Sacks here. So it's an inconsistency that Jewish philosophers and rabbis have to work out on a theoretical level, but on an existential level, on a real level. We have to work, all of us have to work much, much harder, to stay together as one people. Okay, I think we're beyond the time, Yoel, right? So.
Yes, this was great. Thank you. We are beyond the time, but there was just someone who posted a question saying, how did he settle on vegetarianism and veganism, given the Torah mandate to have dominion over all the creatures of the earth? So do you have a quick time to just summarize that?
Yeah. I mean, this is not something that was very prominent about him, but the ideal in the Torah, the ideal is for us to be vegetarians. I mean, if you read through the first chapters of Genesis, what you see is that God gives Adam and Eve the permission to eat vegetables, and it doesn't give permission, to kill animals and to eat meat. That only occurs after the flood of Noah. Why? Because human beings couldn't restrain their aggression. Because they couldn't kill animals, they wound up killing each other. That's the Cain and Abel story, and the violence that took place in the generation of Noah. So as a concession to human weakness, the Torah allowed human beings to kill animals and be carnivores. But there are a few exceptional individuals, moral heroes. I know a number of them, who want to maintain the ideal of the Torah, which is not to kill animals and to be vegetarian. And he was one of them. I don't think he publicized that very much, but what he did was very, very Jewish, and very much consistent with the ideals of the Torah.